In the heart of Granada, where the Sierra Nevada casts its jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of dusk, two men found each other under the weight of an almond tree's shadow. The city, with its labyrinthine streets and the ghosts of flamenco echoing from whitewashed walls, held secrets as old as the Alhambra. It was here, in the spring of 2025, that Mateo and Alejandro's lives intertwined, their love a fragile flame flickering against the wind of tradition. Mateo was a painter, 32, with hands stained by ochre and indigo, his eyes carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much of the world's edges. He lived in a small attic in the Albaycin, where the rooftops leaned toward each other like conspirators. His canvases were wild, filled with swirling reds and greens, capturing the pulse of Andalusia, olive groves under moonlight, the cry of a guitar, the ache of unspoken desires. Yet his heart was a locked room, guarded by years of silence. In a Spain where love between men was no longer a crime, but still a whisper in certain quarters, Mateo painted his longing into abstractions, hiding his truth in plain sight. Alejandro, 28, was a guitarist, his fingers calloused from strings that sang of sorrow and fire. He played in the caves of Sacromonte, where the gypsies wove music into the night, their voices rising like smoke. Alejandro had come to Granada from a small village in Jaén, fleeing the suffocating gaze of a family bound by tradition. His father, a stern olive farmer, had called his son's dreams a sin against the earth. Alejandro carried this wound, but his music was his rebellion, a cascade of notes that spoke of freedom, of love that refused to be buried. Their meeting was not chance, but fate, as Lorca might have written, ordained by the moon that hung low over Granada. It was April, and the almond trees were in bloom, their petals falling like snow. Mateo had wandered into Sacromonte one evening, drawn by the sound of a guitar that seemed to weep and laugh at once. In a dimly lit cave, he saw Alejandro, his dark hair falling over eyes that burned with intensity. The music stopped Mateo's breath, not because it was beautiful though it was, but because it felt like a mirror to his own unspoken heart. Alejandro noticed the stranger at the edge of the crowd, a man with paint-flecked hands and a gaze that lingered too long. After the performance, as the crowd thinned, Mateo approached, his voice hesitant. "Your music," he said, "it's like a painting I can't finish." Alejandro smiled, a half-moon curve that hid 1,000 questions. "And your eyes," he replied, "they see too much." That night they talked until the stars faded, sharing stories of dreams and wounds, of a Spain that was both home and cage. In the heart of Granada, where the Sierra Nevada casts its jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of dusk, two men found each other under the weight of an almond tree's shadow. The city, with its labyrinthine streets and the ghosts of flamenco echoing from whitewashed walls, held secrets as old as the Alhambra. It was here, in the spring of 2025, that Mateo and Alejandro's lives intertwined, their love a fragile flame flickering against the wind of tradition. Mateo was a painter, 32, with hands stained by ochre and indigo, his eyes carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much of the world's edges. He lived in a small attic in the Albaycin, where the rooftops leaned toward each other like conspirators. His canvases were wild, filled with swirling reds and greens, capturing the pulse of Andalusia, olive groves under moonlight, the cry of a guitar, the ache of unspoken desires. Yet his heart was a locked room, guarded by years of silence. In a Spain where love between men was no longer a crime, but still a whisper in certain quarters, Mateo painted his longing into abstractions, hiding his truth in plain sight. Alejandro, 28, was a guitarist, his fingers calloused from strings that sang of sorrow and fire. He played in the caves of Sacromonte, where the gypsies wove music into the night, their voices rising like smoke. Alejandro had come to Granada from a small village in Jaén, fleeing the suffocating gaze of a family bound by tradition. His father, a stern olive farmer, had called his son's dreams a sin against the earth. Alejandro carried this wound, but his music was his rebellion, a cascade of notes that spoke of freedom, of love that refused to be buried. Their meeting was not chance, but fate, as Lorca might have written, ordained by the moon that hung low over Granada. It was April, and the almond trees were in bloom, their petals falling like snow. Mateo had wandered into Sacramonte one evening, drawn by the sound of a guitar that seemed to weep and laugh at once. In a dimly lit cave, he saw Alejandro, his dark hair falling over eyes that burned with intensity. The music stopped Mateo's breath, not because it was beautiful though it was, but because it felt like a mirror to his own unspoken heart. Alejandro noticed the stranger at the edge of the crowd, a man with paint-flecked hands and a gaze that lingered too long. After the performance, as the crowd thinned, Mateo approached, his voice hesitant. "Your music," he said, "it's like a painting I can't finish." Alejandro smiled, a half-moon curve that hid 1,000 questions. "And your eyes," he replied, "they see too much." That night they talked until the stars faded, sharing stories of dreams and wounds, of a Spain that was both home and cage. But Lorca's world is never without tragedy. On the train, Alejandro's hand trembled in Mateo's, his face pale. "I am scared," he admitted, his voice barely above the clatter of the wheels. "Not of them, but of losing you." Mateo kissed his forehead, tasting salt and resolve. "We are the sea now," he said. "No one can hold us." In Cádiz, they found a small apartment overlooking the Atlantic, where the waves sang a lullaby each night. Mateo painted the ocean, its blues and greens a testament to their survival. Alejandro played for tourists on the boardwalk, his music no longer a secret, but a gift. They were not free of judgment, eyes still lingered, voices still whispered, but they had each other, and that was enough. Years later, when the almond trees bloomed again in Granada, a painting hung in a small gallery in the Albarcin. It was Mateo's, a swirl of colors, depicting two figures under a tree, their hands entwined, a guitar resting against the trunk. Below it, a plaque read, "For Alejandro, my sea, my shadow." And in the caves of Sacramonte, a guitarist played a melody that sounded like love, like defiance, like a story that refused to end. The train to Cádiz rattled through the night, its rhythm a heartbeat beneath their clasped hands. The carriage was half empty, the other passengers lost in their own worlds. Old men reading newspapers, a young woman staring out at the blurred olive groves. Mateo leaned against Alejandro, his head resting on his shoulder, the scent of his lover's skin a mix of cedar and sweat. Outside, Andalusia unfolded in shadows, the Sierra's teeth biting the sky, the moon a silver coin tossed into the dark. Alejandro's guitar case lay at their feet, a silent witness to their flight. "I've never seen the sea," Alejandro said, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. His fingers traced the veins on Mateo's wrist, a map of their shared pulse. "In Jaén, we had fields, dust, the sun that burned everything. But the sea, it's different, isn't it?" Mateo smiled, his eyes catching the reflection of passing lights. "It's alive," he said. "It moves. It breathes. It holds you without asking who you are." He paused, his throat tightening. "Like us." Alejandro turned to him, his dark eyes searching. "Will it be enough? Cádiz, the sea, us?" The question hung like a note held too long, trembling with the weight of their future. "It has to be," Mateo replied. But his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. He thought of the almond tree in Granada, its branches heavy with blossoms, its roots deep in a soil that both nurtured and confined. They were leaving that tree behind, but could they truly escape the roots of their past? In Cádiz, they arrived at dawn, the city waking in a blush of pink and gold. The sea stretched before them, a vast mirror reflecting the sky's first light. Their apartment, a cramped second-floor space above a fishmonger's shop, smelled of salt and possibility. The walls were peeling, the windows rattled in their frames, but to Mateo and Alejandro, it was a palace. They stood on the tiny balcony, the Atlantic's breath cool against their faces, and for the first time they kissed without looking over their shoulders. Life in Cádiz was not easy, but it was theirs. Mateo found work restoring murals in a small church, his hands coaxing saints and angels back to life on crumbling plaster. The priest, an old man with kind eyes, never asked about the man who waited for Mateo at home, but his silence felt like a blessing. Alejandro played his guitar on the boardwalk, his music drawing crowds of tourists and locals alike. His falsettas wove stories of Granada's caves, of love that burned like a bonfire, and sometimes, when Mateo watched from the edge of the crowd, He saw tears in the eyes of strangers. But the past is a tide that returns. One evening, as the sun sank into the sea, Alejandro received a letter. It was from his brother, Miguel, written in a jagged scrawl. "Father is dying," it read. "He asks for you. Come home." Alejandro sat on their sagging couch, the letter trembling in his hands. Mateo knelt before him, his paint-stained fingers brushing Alejandro's cheek. "You don't have to go," he said. "Not if it hurts you." Alejandro's eyes were wet, not with tears, but with the weight of memory. "He's my father," he said. "Even if he hates what I am, he's my blood." The words cut Mateo. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Family, in Spain, was a chain. Beautiful and heavy, unbreakable even when it bruised. They returned to Jaén together, the train ride a mirror of their escape from Granada. But this time, the air was thick with dread. The village was unchanged. Olive trees stretching to the horizon, the church bell tolling like a warning. Alejandro's family home was a squat stone house, its walls baked by decades of sun. His father, Diego, lay in a bed that smelled of medicine and regret, his face gaunt, his eyes clouded. Miguel stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his gaze ablaze. "You came," Diego rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro nodded, his throat too tight for words. Mateo stood by the door, an outsider in this house of blood and history. Diego's eyes flicked to him, sharp despite his frailty. "Who is he?" he asked, though the question felt like an accusation. "He's my life," Alejandro said, his voice steady now, a guitar string plucked with defiance. Diego's face twisted, not in anger, but in something softer. Alejandro knelt by the bed, his hand hovering over his father's, but not touching. "I am strong," he said, "because of him." The room was silent save for the labored breathing of a dying man. Diego closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, it was to no one. "The earth takes everything," he murmured, "even love." Diego died that night, under a sky pricked with stars. Alejandro wept, not for the man who had rejected him, but for the boy he had been, the one who had once believed his father's love was unbreakable. Mateo held him, their shadows merging on the stone floor, and whispered, "We are enough." Back in Cádiz, the sea became their refuge. They walked the beach at night, the waves lapping at their bare feet, the salt air cleansing their wounds. Mateo painted a series of canvases, blues and greens swirling into figures that could be two men or two waves, indistinguishable. Alejandro composed a new piece, a soleá that began with sorrow and ended with hope, its notes rising like gulls over the water. They were not free of the world's judgment. Neighbors whispered, tourists stared, but they learned to carry their love like a shield, its weight, a strength. One spring, they returned to Granada, not to stay, but to remember. The almond tree in the forgotten courtyard was still there, its branches heavier now, its blossoms a cascade of white. They stood beneath it, hand in hand, and Alejandro played a melody that felt like a prayer. Mateo traced the tree's bark with his finger, imagining the roots beneath, the ones that had held them and let them go. "This is where we began," he said. "And where we continue," Alejandro replied, his smile a crescent moon. They kissed, the tree's shadow cool against their skin, and Granada, for once, was silent. The Cádiz sun burned with a fierce tenderness, its light spilling over the rooftops and into the narrow streets where Mateo and Alejandro carved their new life. Their apartment above the fishmonger's shop was a fragile sanctuary, its walls echoing with the sea's murmur and the laughter they fought to keep alive. Each morning Mateo woke to the sound of Alejandro's guitar, a soft falsetto that greeted the dawn like a lover's whisper. Each evening Alejandro returned from the boardwalk, his pockets heavy with coins, his heart heavier with the weight of strangers' stares. They were happy, or so they told themselves. Mateo's murals in the church grew bolder, the saint's eyes now holding a spark of defiance, as if they, too, knew the cost of love. Alejandro's music drew larger crowds, his fingers weaving stories of Granada's caves, of a man who loved another man under a moon that refused to judge. But happiness, in Lorca's world, is a flame that flickers, and Cádiz, for all its openness, was still Spain, a land where tradition danced with progress, sometimes stepping on its toes. One afternoon, as Mateo mixed pigments in the church's cool shadow, a woman approached him. She was middle-aged, her face lined like the pages of a well-read book, her shawl black as widow's grief. "You're the painter," she said, her voice sharp but curious. "The one who lives with the guitarist." Mateo nodded, his heart a drum against his ribs. "My son," she continued, "he saw you together. He says, it's unnatural." Her words were not cruel, but they carried the weight of 1,000 whispers, the kind that followed them in Granada, in Jaén, and now here. "It's love," Mateo said, his voice steady though his hands trembled. "What's unnatural about that?" The woman studied him, her eyes narrowing, then softening. "My husband would have beaten him for saying such things," she said. "But I don't know." She turned away, her shawl catching the light like a raven's wing, and Mateo felt the air grow heavy, as if the saints on the walls were holding their breath. That evening, he told Alejandro, his words spilling out over a dinner of gazpacho and bread. Alejandro listened, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass, his face a mask of calm that hid a storm. "They'll always talk," he said at last. "In my village they called it sin. Here, they call it strange. But it's ours, Mateo. Let them choke on their words." He reached across the table, his hand warm against Mateo's. But the gesture felt fragile, like a petal caught in the wind. The whispers grew louder. A neighbor, an old man with a face like cracked leather, spat as they passed, muttering maricones under his breath. A group of boys threw stones at Alejandro one night as he played, their laughter sharp as glass. Mateo wanted to rage, to paint the walls of Cádiz with their love, to scream that they were human, nothing less. But Alejandro, ever the quieter fire, held him back. "We fight by living," he said, "by loving. That's our war. Yet war, even a quiet one, takes its toll." Alejandro began to play less, his music retreating into their apartment, where only Mateo heard its trembling notes. Mateo's paintings grew darker, the blues of the sea now streaked with crimson, as if the waves bled. They argued, not with shouts but with silences, the kind that grew like ivy, choking the spaces between them. One night, after a dinner left uneaten, Alejandro stood by the balcony, the sea a restless mirror behind him. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice barely above the waves, "if we're fighting a battle we can't win?" Mateo froze, his brush poised over a canvas that depicted two figures dissolving into the ocean. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he feared the answer. "I'm saying I'm tired," Alejandro admitted, his eyes wet with the salt of unshed tears. "Tired of the looks, the words, the weight of it all. I love you, Mateo, but sometimes I wonder if love is enough." The words were a knife, not because they were meant to wound, but because they were true. Mateo crossed the room, his hands framing Alejandro's face, searching for the man who had defied his father, who had shielded him in Granada. "It's enough," Mateo said, his voice fierce. "It has to be, because without it, we're nothing." Alejandro leaned into his touch, his breath a shudder, and they held each other as the sea sang its endless song. But the doubt lingered, a shadow cast by no tree, and Mateo feared it would grow. The turning point came in autumn, when the Cádiz sky turned the color of bruised plums. A festival was held along the beach, a celebration of the sea with bonfires, flamenco, his and wine that flowed like blood. Alejandro was asked to play, his reputation as a guitarist still strong despite his retreat. He hesitated, his fingers twitching as if the strings might burn. Mateo took his hand, his eyes steady. "Play for us," he said. "Not for them. For us." The night of the festival, the beach was alive with light and sound. Bonfires crackled, their flames licking the stars, and the crowd swayed to the rhythm of clapping hands and stamping feet. Alejandro took his place on a makeshift stage, his guitar gleaming like a crescent moon. Mateo stood at the edge, his heart a drum, his eyes fixed on the man he loved. Alejandro's first notes were tentative, a falsetto that trembled like a leaf in the wind. But then his fingers found their fire, and the music soared, a solear that spoke of Granada's almond trees, of Jaén's olive fields, of a love that refused to break. The crowd fell silent, then erupted, their cheers a wave crashing against the shore. Mateo saw tears in the eyes of strangers, saw hands clapping not in judgment but in awe. For the first time, Alejandro played without fear, his music a bridge between their world and the one that watched. When the final note faded, he looked at Mateo, his smile a beacon, and Mateo knew they had won a battle, if not the war. Afterward they walked the beach, the bonfires dying behind them. The sea was calm, its surface a mirror for the stars. Alejandro stopped, his guitar slung over his shoulder, and took Mateo's hand. "I was wrong," he said. "Love is enough. You make it enough." Mateo kissed him, the salt of the sea on their lips, and for a moment, Cádiz was theirs alone. The Cádiz winter arrived softly. Not with snow, but with a damp chill that clung to the bones like regret. The sea, once a mirror of freedom, turned restless, its waves gnashing at the shore like teeth. Mateo and Alejandro's apartment, with its peeling walls and rattling windows, became a cocoon, where they wove their days with quiet rituals, Mateo painting by the weak light of a lamp, Alejandro practicing scales that curled like smoke. But love, even one as fierce as theirs, could not shield them from the world's insistence on breaking in. It began with a knock at the door one January evening, sharp and insistent, like the crack of a whip. Mateo opened it to find a man he did not know, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from the same stone as Jaén's olive fields. "You're the painter," the man said, his voice low, his eyes flicking past Mateo to where Alejandro stood, guitar in hand. "And you're the guitarist." "I'm Raphael." He paused, his lips tightening. "Miguel sent me." Alejandro's face paled, his fingers tightening on the guitar's neck. Miguel, his brother, had not spoken to him since their father's death, his silence a wall, thicker than words. "What does he want?" Alejandro asked, his voice steady but thin, like a string stretched to breaking. Raphael stepped inside, uninvited, his boots leaving mud on the floor. "He wants you to stop," he said. "Your music, your life. It's a disgrace to the family, to Jaén." He glanced at Mateo, his eyes cold as the winter sea. "He says you've corrupted his brother. He wants you gone." Mateo felt his blood rise, hot and sharp. But Alejandro spoke first, his voice a blade. "Miguel has no claim on me," he said. "Tell him to keep his shame. I've carried it long enough." Raphael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, only dropped a crumpled letter on the table and left, the door slamming like a gunshot. The letter was brief, written in Miguel's jagged hand. "You are no brother of mine. End this, or I will." Alejandro read it once, then let it fall, his hands trembling. Mateo knelt beside him, his voice soft but fierce. "He can't touch us here," he said. "This is our home." But Alejandro's eyes were distant, lost in a memory of olive groves and a father's rejection. "He's my blood," he whispered, "and blood cuts deep." The threat hung over them like a storm cloud, its shadow darkening their days. Alejandro's music grew jagged, his falsettos breaking mid-phrase, as if the notes themselves were afraid. Mateo's paintings turned inward, the sea now a vortex, swallowing the figures he once painted with hope. They spoke less, their silences heavy with unspoken fears. Mateo wondered if love, for all its strength, could withstand a world that refused to let it breathe. "I'd never leave you," Mateo replied, but the words felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. They sat together, the silence between them a wound, until Alejandro spoke again. "I'm scared, Mateo, not of Miguel, but of losing myself, of losing us." Mateo took his hand, his fingers tracing the calluses that told their story. "We're still here," he said. "We'll fight." The fight came sooner than they expected. One morning, as Mateo worked in the church, restoring a mural of Saint Sebastian pierced with arrows, a shadow fell across his canvas. It was Raphael, with two other men, their faces hard, their hands curled into fists. "You didn't listen," Raphael said. "Miguel said you wouldn't." Mateo stood, his brush falling to the floor, paint splattering like blood. "Get out," he said, his voice low but steady. "This is a house of God." Raphael laughed, a sound like breaking stones. "God doesn't want you here," he said, "or anywhere." The men advanced, their shadows looming like the Sierra's peaks, but the priest appeared, his frail form a surprising wall. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "This is my church, and he is my worker. Leave." The men hesitated, then retreated, their footsteps echoing like a fading storm. Mateo returned home, shaken but whole, and told Alejandro everything. For the first time in weeks, Alejandro's eyes burned with fire, not fear. "We can't keep running," he said. "Not from Miguel, not from anyone." He picked up his guitar, his fingers finding a new melody, a bulería that pulsed with defiance, its rhythm a heartbeat against the dark. "We'll show them," he said. "We'll live." They decided to fight by creating. Mateo began a new series of paintings, not for the church but for the world, canvases that showed two men dancing under almond trees, their bodies entwined like waves, their faces unashamed. Alejandro composed a suite, a cycle of songs that told their story: Granada's shadows, Jaén's wounds, Cádiz's sea. They planned an exhibition, a night where art and music would speak louder than hate, in a small gallery by the beach. The night of the exhibition arrived in March, the air sharp with the promise of spring. The gallery was crowded, not just with tourists but with locals, fishermen, shopkeepers, even the woman in the black shawl who had questioned Mateo months before. Alejandro played, his guitar a voice that rose above the waves, each note a declaration of love, of survival. Mateo's paintings glowed under the lights, their colors a rebellion against silence. The crowd watched, some with tears, some with frowns, but all with eyes that saw. When Alejandro finished, the room was silent, then erupted in applause, not polite but wild, like the sea in a storm. Mateo joined him, their hands clasped, their smiles a shared victory. The woman in the shawl approached, her face softer now. "I was wrong," she said. "Your love, it's beautiful." She left before they could respond, her shawl trailing like a shadow released. That night, they walked the beach, the sea calm, the stars a scattering of almond blossoms against the sky. "We did it," Alejandro said, his voice steady, his hand warm in Mateo's. "We're still here." Mateo looked at him, his heart a canvas painted with hope. "And we'll keep being here," he said, "for us." Spring in Cádiz was a riot of color, the sea glinting like a sapphire under the April sun, the air thick with the scent of orange blossoms and salt. Mateo and Alejandro's apartment, once a fragile refuge, now felt like a fortress, its walls adorned with sketches and half-finished canvases, its air humming with the soft strum of Alejandro's guitar. The exhibition had changed them not because it silenced the whispers, those would never fully stop, but because it gave their love a voice, a shape that others could see, could touch. The woman in the black shawl had called it beautiful, and that word, so simple, so rare, became a talisman they carried in their hearts. But Lorca's world is never without its shadows, and in Spain the past is a tide that returns unbidden. One morning, as Mateo swept paint across a canvas depicting two figures embracing under a wave, a letter arrived, slipped under their door like a thief. It was from Miguel, Alejandro's brother, and its words were sharp as olive thorns. "You think you've won, but you've only shamed us further. I'm coming to Cádiz. This ends." Alejandro read it in silence, his face a mask, but his hands betrayed him, trembling as they held the paper. "He won't stop," Alejandro said, his voice low like the sea before a storm. Mateo set down his brush, his heart a drumbeat of fear and resolve. "Let him come," he said. "We've faced worse." But the words felt hollow, for Miguel was not just a man, but a symbol of the world they had fought to escape, a world of blood ties and unyielding tradition. Miguel arrived on a Sunday when the church bells rang like a call to judgment. He stood in their doorway, taller than Mateo remembered, his eyes dark as the earth of Jaén, his hands clenched as if holding back a flood. "You're still here," he said to Alejandro, ignoring Mateo. "Still playing your songs, living this life." The word was a sneer, a stone thrown into their sanctuary. Alejandro stood, his guitar leaning against the wall, like a silent ally. "This is my life," he said, his voice steady but laced with pain. "You can't take it from me." Miguel's gaze flicked to Mateo, hard and cold. "You took my brother," he said. "You turned him into something he's not." Mateo stepped forward, his hands stained with paint, his voice fierce. "He's more himself now than he ever was in Jaén, and I love him." The room was a held breath, the sea outside roaring as if in warning. Miguel's face twisted, not with anger, but with something deeper, something broken. "You don't understand," he said. "Our father died ashamed. Our name is dust because of you." Alejandro's eyes filled, not with tears, but with the weight of memory. "Father died because he couldn't see me," he said, "but you can, Miguel. You're still here." For a moment it seemed Miguel might soften, his shoulders slumping like a tree bending in the wind. But then he straightened, his voice hard again. "I came to end this," he said, "to bring you home." He reached for Alejandro, his hand a claw, but Mateo moved faster, placing himself between them. "You'll have to go through me," he said, his heart racing, his body a shield. Miguel froze, his hand hovering, then fell. "You're both fools," he said, but his voice cracked, and he turned away, leaving the door open to the Cádiz wind. Alejandro sank to the floor, his breath ragged, and Mateo held in their bodies a single shadow against the wall. "He's gone," Mateo whispered, but Alejandro shook his head. "He's not gone," he said. "He's in me, always will be." The confrontation left scars, not on their skin, but on their spirits. Alejandro's music grew quiet, his fingers hesitating over the strings, as if afraid of what they might say. Mateo's paintings turned inward, the figures now half dissolved, their edges bleeding into the canvas like tears into the sea. They loved each other fiercely, but love, even theirs, could falter under the weight of doubt. One night, as the sea churned under a storm, Alejandro spoke the words Mateo had feared. "What if he's right?" he said, his voice barely above the rain. "What if we're fighting for something that can't last?" Mateo's heart broke, not because Alejandro doubted their love, but because he doubted himself. He took Alejandro's hands, his paint-stained fingers tracing the calluses that had played their story. "We last," he said, "not because it's easy, but because we choose it. Every day we choose it." Alejandro looked at him, his eyes a storm of fear and hope, and nodded. "I choose you," he said, and they kissed, the rain a curtain around their world. The next morning, they made a plan, not to run but to root themselves deeper. They would return to Granada, not as fugitives, but as men claiming their place. They packed their bag, Mateo's paints, Alejandro's guitar, and took the train back to the city, where their love began. The almond tree in the forgotten courtyard was still there, its branches bare now, but its roots strong, a silent witness to their story. They stood beneath it, hand in hand, and Alejandro played a new melody, a fandango that rose like a phoenix, its notes weaving their past and future. Granada was different now, or perhaps they were. The old women in black shawls still watched, but their eyes held less judgment, more curiosity. The men in the bars still whispered, but their voices were softer, as if unsure. Mateo and Alejandro walked the Albayzín streets, their hands entwined, their love a banner. They visited the caves of Sacramonte, where Alejandro played for the gypsies, his music a bridge between worlds. The crowd clapped, their hands a rhythm of acceptance. And Mateo painted in his mind, a canvas of two men under an almond tree, their shadows one. When they returned to Cádiz, they carried Granada with them, not as a weight, but as a strength. Miguel did not follow, but his letter came months later, a single line. "I'm trying to understand." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the stone, a space where light might enter. Alejandro kept the letter, not as a chain, but as a hope, and Mateo painted a new canvas, a sea under a sky of almond blossoms, two figures standing firm against the tide. Their love was not a victory over the world, for the world would always have its thorns, but it was a victory over fear, over silence. They lived, they loved, and in Cádiz, under the shadow of the sea, they were enough. The Cádiz summer of 2025 arrived like a lover, warm and unhurried, the sea a sapphire ribbon stretched to the horizon. Mateo and Alejandro's apartment, now a tapestry of their lives, paint-spattered walls, a guitar resting in the corner, felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Miguel's letter, a single line of tentative understanding, lay folded in a drawer, not a promise but a seed planted in barren earth. They dared to hope, not for the world to change, but for their place in it to grow roots, like the almond tree that still stood in Granada's forgotten courtyard. Their days settled into a rhythm, not perfect but theirs. Mateo's murals in the church were finished, the saints now gazing down with eyes that seemed to see beyond dogma, their halos tinged with the blues of the sea. The priest, old and quiet, had hung one of Mateo's smaller paintings in the sacristy, a swirl of almond blossoms and waves, unsigned but unmistakable. Alejandro's music returned to the boardwalk, his falsettos brighter now, weaving stories of survival that drew crowds who clapped not just for the notes but for the man who played them. They were not free of judgment, whispers lingered, eyes still narrowed, but they carried their love like a flame, shielded but unafraid. One evening, as the sun bled gold into the sea, Mateo proposed an idea, his voice soft but steady over a dinner of grilled sardines and wine. "Let's create something permanent," he said, his paint-stained hand tracing circles on the table. "Not just for us, but for others, for those who hide, who fear." Alejandro's eyes, dark as the olives of Jaén, met his, a question forming. "What do you mean?" he asked, his fingers pausing on the glass.
"A place," Mateo said. "A gallery, a stage, a space where love like ours can breathe, where art and music tell our stories."
The idea had grown in him since the exhibition, a seed watered by the woman in the black shawl's words, by the applause that had drowned out hate. Alejandro smiled, a crescent moon breaking through clouds. "A sanctuary," he said, "like the sea, like the almond tree." They clinked glasses, the wine catching the light, and began to dream. The plan took shape over months, fueled by their savings, their courage, and the unexpected kindness of strangers. The priest offered a small donation, his hands trembling as he pressed the money into Mateo's palm. A fisherman whose son had left Cádiz for Madrid to live openly brought them a crate of wine, his gruff voice saying, "For your dream." Even the woman in the black shawl returned, her son now at her side, his eyes shy but no longer hard. "Build it," she said, and left a rosary, its beads worn smooth by prayer. They found a space, a crumbling warehouse by the beach, its walls weathered by salt and time. They worked through the autumn, Mateo painting murals of almond trees and seas, Alejandro testing the acoustics with his guitar, the notes echoing like a heartbeat. They called it La Sombra del Almendro, the almond tree's shadow, a name that held their past and their promise. The opening was set for December, when Cádiz would glow with Christmas lights, the air sharp with hope. But Lorca's world is never without its final test, and theirs came unannounced. On a November night, as they painted the warehouse's interior, the door creaked open and Miguel stood there, his silhouette a jagged tear in the lamplight. Alejandro froze, his guitar slipping from his hands, the strings humming a discordant note. Mateo stepped forward, his heart a drum, but Miguel raised a hand, not in threat but in surrender. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his voice rough, like earth turned after a long drought. Alejandro's eyes searched his brother's, finding not anger but something softer, something raw. "Why then?" he asked, his voice trembling. Miguel looked at the walls, at the murals of waves and blossoms, at the stage where a guitar waited. "I read about this place," he said. "In Jaén they talk. They say you're building something that matters." He paused, his hands clenching, then opening. "I don't understand you, Alejandro. I don't know if I ever will, but I don't want to lose you." The words were not love, not yet, but they were a bridge, fragile as a spider's thread. Alejandro crossed it, stepping toward his brother, his arms open but hesitant. They did not embrace, not then, but they stood close, their shadows merging on the painted wall. Mateo watched, his throat tight, and saw the almond tree in his mind, its branches heavy with possibility. "Stay for the opening," he said, his voice steady. Miguel nodded, a single jerk of his head, and left, the door closing softly behind him. The opening of La Sombra del Almendro was a night of fire and light. The warehouse glowed, its murals alive under lanterns, the stage a beacon. Alejandro played, his suite of songs a tapestry of their journey, Granada's shadows, Jaén's wounds, Cádiz's sea. Mateo's paintings hung like windows to their souls, each canvas a love letter. The crowd was diverse, fishermen, tourists, gypsies, even the woman in the black shawl, her son clapping beside her. Miguel stood at the back, his face unreadable, but his presence a weight lifted. When Alejandro finished, the applause was a wave, crashing and unending. He called Mateo to the stage, their hands entwined, their smiles a shared vow. "This is for us," Alejandro said to the crowd, his voice clear, "and for anyone who loves, who dares." The crowd roared, and Mateo saw tears not of pity but of recognition, in eyes that had once looked away. Later they stood on the beach, the sea a mirror for the stars, the warehouse's lights a soft glow behind them. "We did it," Mateo said, his voice thick with wonder. Alejandro took his hand, his fingers warm, his calluses a map of their story. "We're still doing it," he said. "Every day, we're still doing it." In the years that followed, La Sombra del Almendro became a haven not just for them but for others, young men holding hands, women whispering love, artists painting truths too long hidden. Miguel visited sometimes, his words few but his presence steady, a bridge growing stronger. The almond tree in Granada bloomed each spring, its petals falling like snow, and Mateo painted it, his canvases now in galleries across Spain. Alejandro's music travelled, his songs sung in caves and cities, a melody that refused to fade. Their love was not a fairy tale, for the world still had its thorns. But it was a song, a painting, a shadow cast by an almond tree, stretching across the sea to touch the stars. And in Cádiz, where the waves sang their names, Mateo and Alejandro were enough, forever and always.